Close your eyes for a moment and think of a sound, not a song, not a voice you know, but a sound from the place where you grew up. The clink of milk bottles on a doorstep before dawn, the distant cry of a man somewhere in the next street calling something you could not quite make out. The specific mechanical click of a television set warming up, the tick and glow before the picture arrived, the sound of a fire being raked in the morning, the clatter of ash into the metal bin, the crumple of newspaper being pushed beneath the coals. If you grew up in Britain, France, Germany, or the Netherlands before 1985, one of those sounds just reached you somewhere in the back of your memory, where sounds live when everything else has faded. Number 14 on this list was heard by every person in every town in Britain and across Northern Europe every morning for 100 years and has been entirely silent for 30, so completely absent from the modern soundscape that children who hear a recording of it today ask what it could possibly be. Number 7 was the domestic sound of winter in the working-class European home, heard every evening from October through March for most of the 20th century, and its disappearance was so gradual and so unremarked that most people cannot say exactly when they last heard it. And number 1, the sound at the very top of this list, was the acoustic signature of the working-class European street at its most alive, heard at the same time every morning in every neighborhood from Dublin to Dresden, and now is gone from the modern world as the horse and cart that preceded it. These are 20 sounds of European life that have completely disappeared, heard in the streets and kitchens and back gardens and workplaces of Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands between 1950 and 1985, before the electric motor was sealed inside everything, before the natural materials were replaced by the synthetic ones that do not ring or creak or hiss, and before the personal headphone placed a private soundtrack between every individual and the acoustic world around them. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what sound does to memory is different from what any other sense does. A smell can take you back, a sight can take you back. But a sound from the place and time where you grew up can take you back so completely and so suddenly that for a moment, the intervening decades do not exist. Let us count them down. Number 20, the sound of the rag and bone man. Ragbone, ragbone, the cry, sometimes musical, sometimes guttural, sometimes barely intelligible, was heard in every working-class street in Britain from the early Victorian era through to the late 1970s, delivered from a horse-drawn cart or from a slowly moving van whose driver leaned from the window to produce the call that his counterpart had been producing for 100 years before him. Every city had its version, every district had its particular cadence, and the children who grew up hearing it could identify the man from 3 streets away by the specific rhythm of his call, knowing whether to run and tell their mother or whether it was the other one, the one who only took certain things. When the rag and bone trade was regulated out of existence by local authority waste collection contracts through the late 1970s and 1980s, the cries stopped, and the streets lost a sound that had been part of their acoustic fabric for as long as anyone could remember. Number 19, the sound of the milk float before dawn. The electric milk float was one of the quietest vehicles ever to move through a residential street, and its quietness was itself a distinctive sound, the almost silence of a vehicle that produced only the soft whine of its electric motor, the clink and rattle of glass bottles in their wire crates, and the specific sound of each bottle being placed on a doorstep in the dark. A milkman who knew his round well could complete a street of 40 houses in under 10 minutes, and the sound he made doing it was the gentlest alarm clock in the history of domestic life, heard just below the threshold of waking for the light sleepers and registered by the deeper sleepers as a reassurance that the morning was proceeding normally. When supermarkets made the doorstep delivery economically unviable, and when the remaining milk floats were replaced by diesel delivery vehicles, the specific acoustic signature of the pre-dawn milk round disappeared from the residential streets of Britain and from the equivalent morning delivery sounds of continental Europe. Number 18, the sound of coal being delivered. The coalman's lorry announced itself from 2 streets away with the diesel engine that labored under its load. And then the specific sounds of the delivery began. The scrape of the tailgate, the drag of the 100-weight sacks across the lorry bed, the coalman's footsteps on the garden path, the specific hollow thunder of coal being shot through the coal hole into the cellar below the pavement, or the softer crash of it being tipped into the bunker in the backyard. The sound of coal delivery was a seasonal sound, heard most frequently in September and October when households were stocking up for winter, and its particular combination of diesel, metal, and the distinctive percussion of moving coal was as much a part of the autumn acoustic calendar of working-class Europe as the smell of bonfires and the sight of conkers on the pavement. When North Sea gas central heating replaced the coal fire through the 1970s and 1980s, the coalman's sounds stopped almost completely within a single decade. Number 17. The sound of the manual typewriter in an office. Before the word processor arrived in the early 1980s, every office in Britain, France, and Germany produced a characteristic acoustic environment dominated by the sound of manual typewriters, the rapid percussion of the keys, the distinctive clang of the carriage return at the end of each line, the zip of the platen advancing, and the periodic ring of the margin bell warning that the line was almost full. A typing pool of 20 women in a London office in the early 1970s produced a sound that was simultaneously mechanical and rhythmic, a kind of industrial music in which individual keystrokes combined into a continuous texture of productive activity that could be heard through closed doors and across corridors. When the word processor replaced the typewriter and when computer keyboards produced nothing louder than a soft click, the soundscape of the working office was transformed as completely as if the office had moved into a different building. Number 16. The sound of children playing in the street unsupervised. The street in any working-class European neighborhood between the 1950s and the mid-1970s was a continuously occupied acoustic space during the hours after school and through the long days of school holidays. The sounds of children playing without adult supervision, the calls and shouts of complex games whose rules were known to every child on the street, the impact of a ball against a wall, the rhythmic percussion of a skipping rope on pavement, the argument that erupted and resolved in the democratic governance of the street game produced an acoustic texture that was the sound of healthy public space in full use. When the traffic increased and the stranger danger panic contracted the range of unsupervised children, and when the television then, the game console drew children indoors, the street fell silent in the after-school hours, in a way that the residents of the 1960s would have found both unnatural and slightly alarming. Number 15. The sound of the steam train. Before the diesel and the electric locomotive replaced the steam engine on British and continental European railways through the 1960s and early 1970s, the acoustic world of any town near a railway line was punctuated by the sounds of steam, the distant whistle that warned of a level crossing, the rhythmic chuffing of a train building speed, the rush and roar of an express passing through without stopping, and the specific hiss of a locomotive standing at a platform, releasing pressure from its safety valve, a sound like a giant catching its breath. The steam railway soundscape was the acoustic clock of the community, marking the departure and arrival of services whose times were known by every resident within earshot, providing a rhythmic structure to the day that the silent electric train has never replicated. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the sounds described so far have all been outdoor sounds, the acoustic fabric of the street and the neighborhood. But the next entries describe the indoor sounds, the domestic acoustic world of the working-class European home before synthetic materials, electronic entertainment, and central heating changed the soundscape of the interior as completely as the car in the supermarket changed the soundscape of the street. Number 14. The sound of the coal fire. The coal fire in its iron grate produced a continuous acoustic event throughout the evening hours of autumn and winter, a complex sound that included the low hiss of gas escaping from the burning coal, the occasional sharp crack of a piece of coal splitting in the heat, the softer sound of ash settling through the bars of the grate, and the draft sound of air being drawn up the chimney, which changed pitch and volume with the strength of the wind outside. This was the sound of warmth in the working-class European home, and its association with safety and comfort was so deeply encoded through childhood exposure that the adults who heard it throughout their early lives described the memory of it with a physical sensation of relaxation and well-being that no modern heating system has ever produced. When gas central heating replaced the coal fire through the 1970s and 1980s, the interior of the working-class home became almost entirely silent in the evening. Number 13. The sound of the mangle and the twin tub. The Monday morning laundry sound of the post-war European household was a domestic percussion that began with the filling of the twin tub, continued with the mechanical churning of the wash cycle, and reached its dramatic climax with the mangle, the rubber-rollered wringer that squeezed excess water from the washing. The mangle's sound was both mechanical and physical, the squeak and press of the rollers, the drip of water into the basin below, and the specific sound of wet fabric emerging from the pressure of the rollers under tension. This was the sound of a woman working, heard every Monday morning in every working-class home in Britain and across Northern Europe until the automatic washing machine silenced it, replacing the acoustic Monday of traditional laundry day with a continuous mechanical hum of a process that required neither the woman's presence nor her effort. Number 12. The sound of the wireless and the home service. The BBC Home Service, which became Radio 4 in 1967, structured the working-class household's time in a way that the television and the streaming service have never replicated. The 9 o'clock news, the afternoon play, the Archers, the shipping forecast, and the specific acoustic character of the BBC spoken voice were the audio wallpaper of the working-class kitchen and front room from the late 1940s through to the early 1970s. The specific sound of a valve wireless warming up, the low hum that preceded the signal, and the particular acoustic color of valve amplification were the sounds of information and entertainment in an era before television dominated domestic time. Number 11. The sound of the knocker-up. Before the alarm clock was universal in working-class homes, the knocker-up who came through the streets in the early morning to wake workers for their factory shift was an active profession in Britain and in equivalent trades in France and Germany. The knocker-up carried a long pole with wires or hard peas at the end and used it to tap on the bedroom windows of his clients. His sounds were the pre-dawn sounds of the working neighborhood, the soft footsteps on flagstones, the specific tap of the pole against glass, the pause, the second tap if no response came, and then the movement on to the next address. The knocker-up continued to work in some northern English towns into the 1960s, long after alarm clocks had become affordable, because the social relationship of the service had its own value beyond the merely functional. Number 10. The sound of the ABC cinema on a Saturday morning. The specific acoustic environment of a Saturday morning children's cinema in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s was unlike any other sound in the working-class child's experience. 300 children in a darkened auditorium producing a continuous roar of collective excitement, punctuated by the amplified sound of the film, the scraping of seats, the periodic shushing of the usherette whose torch moved through the noise like a lighthouse beam, and the communal singing of the ABC Miners song at the beginning of each session. When the children's Saturday morning program ended, and when the multiplex replaced the single-screen cinema with its projection booth and its usherettes, these sounds became as completely unavailable as if they had never existed. Second pattern break. This next one is where the most intimate sounds lived, because the sounds described so far have been predominantly public or domestic sounds of activity. But the next entries describe the sounds of the quieter moments, the acoustic texture of ordinary time in the working-class European home and street before the electronic entertainment device filled every available moment of silence with managed sound. Number 9. The sound of horse-drawn vehicles in the street. In the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the horse was not yet completely absent from the working-class European street. The coal man might still use a horse and cart. The rag and bone man in many cities was still drawn by a horse whose hooves on the cobblestones produced the specific percussion of animal locomotion on stone, a sound so different from the rubber tire on tarmac that the children who heard it recognized it as a distinct and exciting event. The sound of a horse's hooves on a hard surface, the specific rhythm of the walk and the trot, was the sound of an older world persisting into the new one, and its complete disappearance from European streets in the decade between 1955 and 1965 was one of the most rapid and complete acoustic transformations in the history of European urban life. Number 8. The sound of the dinner gong and the factory hooter. In the industrial towns of Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, the factory hooter that signaled the beginning and end of the working day and the dinner break was a public acoustic clock whose authority extended across an entire district. At 5:30 in the afternoon, in a mill town in Lancashire, the sound of the hooter was the sound of the working day ending, heard simultaneously by the men in the factory, the women in the houses who were timing their cooking accordingly, and the children in the street who knew it meant fathers would be coming home within the quarter hour. When factories closed and industrial districts were redeveloped, the hooter fell silent, and the acoustic clock of the working-class neighborhood stopped. Number 7. The sound of the coal fire being banked and raked. This is different from the sound of the burning coal fire described earlier. This is the specific sound of the fire being managed, the morning ritual of raking out the previous night's ash, the scrape of the rake across the iron bars, the hollow fall of ash into the metal bin, the crumple of newspaper being pushed beneath the new coal, and the specific whoosh of the fire catching when the draft was opened and the newspaper lit. This was the first sound of the morning in the working-class household throughout the coal era, performed by the first person up, heard from the bedroom by those still in their beds as a signal that the day had begun and warmth was on its way. It was the acoustic equivalent of the smell of bacon frying, a domestic signal rich with associations of comfort and routine. Number 6. The sound of the GPO telephone exchange. The sound of making a telephone call before direct dialing was completely established. The operator's voice asking for the number required, the series of clicks and buzzes as the connection was made through the electromechanical exchange, and the specific quality of the voice that came through the Bakelite handset was entirely different from the smooth silence of the modern mobile call. The exchanges themselves produced a constant mechanical sound, the clicking and switching of the Stroger selectors that connected each call by physically moving through their mechanical positions, audible to exchange workers as the continuous acoustic evidence of the network doing its work. When digital switching replaced the electromechanical exchange through the late 1970s and 1980s, this mechanical acoustic signature of telephony vanished and was replaced by a silence in which the calls continued, but the machinery no longer announced itself. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal, because the final sounds on this list are not the sounds of specific trades or specific technologies. They are the sounds of the texture of daily life itself, the acoustic background that was so constant and so familiar that it was never noticed until it was gone, and whose absence was felt long before it was understood or named. Number 5. The sound of the wireless in the next room. The specific acoustic experience of hearing a radio program through a closed door, the muffled voices and music that suggested a domestic life proceeding normally in an adjacent space, was a constant feature of the working-class European home from the 1940s through to the 1970s. The sound of a program being listened to in another room told you that someone was home without requiring you to seek them out. It was the acoustic evidence of company without the need for conversation, and its replacement by the personalized headphone experience, in which each person in the house is sealed in their own sonic world, changed the acoustic experience of domestic life in ways that no survey of media habits has ever fully captured. Number 4. The sound of the church bells across Europe on a Sunday morning. Before the Sunday morning soundscape became indistinguishable from any other morning, the church bells that rang across every British, French, German, and Belgian community on Sunday morning were a public acoustic event that marked the day as different from all other days. In cities with multiple churches, the overlapping rings of different towers, each with its own pitch and rhythm and pattern, produced a complex acoustic tapestry that was the sound of a community marking its shared weekly rhythm. When church attendance declined through the 1960s and 1970s, and when some communities chose to reduce their bell ringing to avoid complaints from those who no longer shared the tradition, Sunday morning lost its distinctive acoustic identity. Number 3. The sound of the neighbors through the walls. The terraced housing of Britain, France, and Germany was built to tolerances that made the neighbors' lives acoustically present in a way that modern insulation standards have eliminated. You knew when next door had visitors because the voices changed in register. You knew when the baby was unsettled because the rhythmic sound of the pram being rocked came through the shared wall. You knew when there had been a row because the acoustics of the house changed in a perceptible way. This acoustic intimacy provided an involuntary awareness of the welfare of the people beside you that the acoustically isolated modern flat has eliminated, along with the mutual accountability that acoustic intimacy produced. Number 2. The sound of the street at night with no traffic. In the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning, the working-class European street before the car became universal was a profoundly quiet space, a cat on a garden wall, rain on a skylight, a distant train, the specific creaks of a house cooling after the fire had gone out, wind in the chimney, the footsteps of someone coming home late on flagstones, audible from 50 yards because there was nothing else to hear. This quality of night quiet, in which the natural acoustic world became perceptible, was the acoustic environment of the countryside transported into the city, and it was one of the most complete casualties of motorization that nobody has ever measured or mourned. Number 1. The sound of the milkman on the doorstep at dawn. At the very top of this list, above the rag and bone man's cry and the coal fire's morning raking and the factory hooter and all the rest, sits a sound so specific and so completely associated with the working-class European morning of the post-war decades that its disappearance has left a specific silence that older people feel as a physical absence. The sound of the milkman on the doorstep at dawn was not only the clink of the glass bottles, it was the specific sequence of the entire event. The quiet whine of the float approaching, the footsteps on the path, the clink of the arriving bottles being set down, the clink of the empties being collected, the brief pause in which orders were noted, and then the retreating footsteps, the return to the float, and the quiet whine moving away to the next house. This sequence, taking perhaps 45 seconds at each property, was repeated along the entire length of the street before the sky had lightened, and it constituted the first organized sound of the day, the acoustic signal that the world was proceeding as it should, that the previous night was over and the morning was being administered by someone who knew what they were doing. When the milk round contracted through the 1980s and 1990s, and when the last of the electric floats disappeared from the residential streets of Britain and continental Europe, this specific sound sequence stopped, and the working-class morning became acoustically unmarked, beginning with the alarm clock rather than with the world outside the window demonstrating that it was already in motion. These 20 disappeared sounds tell a story that no history of technology or economics or social change has ever told in quite this way. Because sound is not recorded in the written record, and because the people who heard these sounds did not think to write them down while they were still hearing them. They were simply the acoustic environment of a life in progress, and they are gone in the way that all environments go when the activities that produced them cease to exist. Try this, if you can. Before you go to sleep tonight, lie in the dark and listen to what you can hear. And then try to remember what you heard in the same position, in the same dark, in the house where you grew up. The sounds that come back are the sounds of your life before you were old enough to know that you would one day miss them. Your parents and grandparents heard those sounds every day and thought nothing of them. They knew. Now you know too.